So now we're on Revenge of the Island on what if the teams pick the winners, and in this episode, the Toxic Raptors still lose since they originally made their totem and they lost due to bad luck. Now the Maggots would choose. Now they wouldn't pick Stacy since Stacy obviously is very annoying, but they wouldn't really pick her. So I think Joe, being the team leader, would just tell everyone that they're going to pick Lightning because Lightning is a powerhouse, and Joe would want the other team to do bad so they can win challenges. And so I think they agree that Lightning is going to be the first bit of this season. Scott doesn't throw challenges either because Scott gains nothing in the season by throwing challenges. So Scott actually tries here, meaning it's kind of my what if Scott didn't throw challenges, which will be interesting. In episode 2, this is where they have to get the trivia questions. Stacy would actually be pretty decent at this challenge because she brags a lot, and I imagine she's a very intensive person, and she pays a lot of attention to people. So I do think Stacy would do very well here. Stacy would replace Lightning, and she would do worse than he did in the original. And again, it doesn't. The Rats would just do a bit worse than they originally did, but they lost due to Dakota in the original, and so the Maggots got elimination. Again, the Maggots would think who they want to get out here, and B is a top suspect or Dawn. Dawn because she speaks to animals, and B because he's really smart. Now, while Scott is pretty athletic, I don't think they'd go for Scott because I don't think he'd be a heavy target. But I think they go for B since he's smarter of the two. And at this timeline, he's going to do very well in this challenge. So I think B is actually the person who goes home here. So in episode 3, we have the episode where this is the mirrors. So obviously, B's mirror strategy, Scott wouldn't sabotage it, but B's not here. But Dawn could do the exact same thing. So I think Dawn is pretty smart as well. I think Dawn could do the exact same thing that B did in the original. So I do have, without B being here with his strategy, the Rats would do much worse than they originally did. And because he was the only reason they won the challenge, I have the Maggots winning again. And obviously, because of this, the Maggots now decide to pick Scott Chew since he did the best in the challenge. And the girls are just not that impressive in Sam. They wouldn't think much of Sam, so they all decide to gang up on Scott. In episode 4 is the cave challenge, and everybody is with their tightrope. Zoe still gets taken, like in the original, and Mike obviously still looking for her. And then and obviously Brick is still afraid of the dark, which again, he eventually goes back to try and save Zoe and gets taken. In this episode, obviously Dawn gets taken. Because Lightning isn't here, Dawn isn't thrown into a tree. And instead, that they give each other a piggyback ride, so Dawn isn't captured in this version. Sam would tie a rope on to Dakota, Stacy, and Dawn, noticing that other members of the team is missing from the Maggots. Eventually, Joe would get taken, and Cameron and Mike would still save everyone, and Brick would obviously run out to still get the win, and the Maggots lose the challenge. Now, the Rats would obviously want to get rid of someone strong, but they wouldn't know which person to get rid of here, because they don't know this is an elimination episode. And considering the fact that Lightning was already eliminated, they would go for Brick or Joe since they're the strongest members on the team. They would choose to get rid of Brick since he's the strongest member on the team and would actually be a powerhouse that they get rid of. However, Brick swaps to the Rats team, and so he's actually on the Rats team. In episode 5, this is where we have the shooting challenge. So Brick would be the driver, and Dawn would be the shooter. Joe would be the driver, and Zoe would be the shooter. But now that Scott isn't throwing, Dawn would actually intend to actually hit her target. And this race would be very close. But I have to assume that in this challenge that Dawn would be worse than Zoe at shooting. So I do have Zoe winning the challenge here. And unfortunately, even though he just joined the Rats, I think they all vote for Brick because without Scott sabotaging Dawn, there's no reason that they're going to keep Brick around, and the other team would think Brick is a bigger threat. Although everyone would be hesitant to vote for Brick because he was their former teammate, they would kind of realize that Brick is the only reason that they're winning challenges. In episode 6 is the Yeti challenge, and Dawn alone would win this challenge, considering the fact that that she would win this challenge by herself because she could just talk to the Yeti. So Dawn could talk to the Yeti and just simply win the challenge here. Joe would do what she did with her team divisional, and honestly, the maggots don't really change, and so the maggots actually lose the challenge. Now, this is pretty tough because the maggots would have to consider which person to get rid of. Zoe and Maria don't like each other, and Joe is a big powerhouse, and Mike obviously relies on his personalities. They would know that Mike is also pretty strong as well, and Cameron isn't really a threat. However, they picked to get rid of Joe in this version since Joe is the bigger threat, and in this timeline, she obviously is quite likable. And obviously, two people have to swap teams, but because there's no Mike and Cameron, so two people have to swap teams. And to be honest, there's kind of nobody to swap, but two people swap on this episode in the original. And I decided to spin a wheel to determine, because Mike is the strongest player on the team, so I think it'd be Mike. And out of these people, I think it's Dawn. So I think Dawn and Mike would swap teams. And we move on to episode 7. So in episode 7, mine is a terrible thing. They all go in the cave and Mike would find his torch. Anne Maria isn't distracted with Cat with Mike, and obviously she's still taken by Ezekiel. Dawn and Zoe are talking, and Dawn explains, the parts of Mike do love her. This confuses Zoe, but because Zoe and Dawn were seen to get on really well, I can actually see Zoe and Dawn becoming friends in this episode. Cameron would do decently well what he did in the original, and honestly, Sam would be okay here, and his head would get onto mush. Since at this point, he wouldn't have gone to mush as badly since Dakota's here, and because Sam and Dakota are now in the game together, if anything, I actually think they get together faster, considering the fact Sam and Dakota would now be at the stage of nearly dating. Stacy would annoy her entire team, which would basically get Mike fed up, and Mike feeling get bad that Dakota and Sam had to deal with this. Stacy would realize what kind of bond the group and saying, she makes up a bunch of stuff, and she's just trying to fit in. Mike then says it's okay, but she just needs to be honest with them, and she can generally become friends with them. This makes Stacy happy. Eventually, they get to the cave, and obviously they still meet Anne Maria, who gives given the fake diamond. Now, without Brick to turn around and sacrifice himself for the rats, there's no reason for the rats to win the challenge here. However, Mike would go around to save Zoe and Cameron after similar to how Brick does in the original, as Mike would turn around to save his team, giving the maggots the win. And due to the fact Mike saved them, and due to the fact Dawn just swapped over with Mike, Dawn, out of respect, would decide not to vote for Mike in this elimination. Instead, they picked between Stacy, Dakota, or Sam, and they picked Stacy, since she is basically the least connected, and she's just liked the least of the team. Stacy would be sad, but would thank Dakota and Sam and Mike for their words of encouragement as she goes home. Anne Maria still quits the competition as she's given the fake diamond after realizing she's launched off Stacy and wants to get back in the game until Chris says nah. Now in episode 7, this is pretty tough because obviously at this point in the series, B had originally taken her elimination, but I decided to spin a wheel to determine which character would return, and I thought it was the fairest way of writing the episode, so I decided to bring back B because he was eliminated in episode 2, and this was the episode Dom was eliminated. So I thought the fairest way of writing the episode was to bring back B. B would be put in the maggots team, however, unlike Dakota, he wouldn't be mutated, so he'd actually come back as normal. Obviously, Dawn and B would be happy to see each other since they're friends. And of course, they ended up being friendly with each other. Now, of course, in the end, they race around, and because Dakota's here and they have to actually go around the bush, on top of the fact the maggots would just do worse, I think the maggots would do better since B and Cameron on the team would end up being very good at navigation. So I do have the maggots winning the challenge. And Dawn and B would want to get rid of Mike. However, Zoe and Cameron would want to get rid of Dakota. And this would be a problem since the team can't decide which two people to vote off here. However, this would have to lead to a tiebreaker. So, I don't know what this tiebreaker would be because there wasn't an episode in this original tiebreaker. And so, Mike would beat Dakota in just about any tiebreaker. So, I do think Dawn and B would vote for Dakota simply because of the fact they'd look at the logic of the situation. I know that Mike, Zoe, and Cameron are very close. And of course, Dakota always is the tiebreaker. And there we go. So now we're at the merge, and this is Grand Chef Auto. And of course, in this episode, and Dawn and B would end up driving the cars, and Sam, they would do pretty well. As Dawn and B would get kidnapped by Chef and just get locked in the cages. Obviously, they could, because they're not as strong as Lightning, they're not able to break out. And in this challenge, I think Mike would win because he wouldn't be distracted as he was in the original. Mike, Zoe, and Cameron vote for Mike would choose who to eliminate, and out of this group of people, he would be friends with Sam, Zoe, Mike, and Cameron. He would choose to eliminate B since he's the least connected and he wouldn't know him. So he gets rid of B. In episode 10, we have where they have to make their blimp, and obviously Dawn and Sam do pretty well. I think Dawn wins the challenge here since she would be pretty much the best. Cameron's still here to win immunity, and they vote for Sam since Zoe's friends with Dawn, and they would want to keep Dawn over Sam. In episode 11, we have the cooking challenge, and everybody does pretty bad here. And Dawn would win the challenge since Mike, Zoe, and Cameron would all be friends with each other and would want to wait for each other, meaning Dawn would win immunity. Mike, Zoe would vote for Cameron, and Dawn would talk to Cameron to vote for Zoe or Mike. However, it doesn't really matter because Cameron is going home. In episode 12, we have the episode where it's the race to the end. Now, obviously, this is where they have to have the map in the original, and Mike and Zoe would have a map with each other, and it's treated with two people being close, one being the outsider. Obviously, the only difference is Dawn is not a powerhouse like Lightning, so it's a lot more even. So when Zoe goes commando, actually Zoe might not go commando here with Mike being present. But anyway, when Zoe goes commando, because Mike would understand Zoe as an alt personality, she'd be able to talk to him, and when Mike gets attacked by the branch, Zoe would go back to save Mike, giving Dawn the win. Between Mike and Zoe, Dawn would find this really tough since Mike, she doesn't really know Mike, and Zoe was on her team and her friend. And at the same time, Zoe has been shown to be a very huge threat in this challenge. However, I don't think Dawn really thinks much strategically, and while she does think a bit strategically, I think she mostly thinks of friendship and good people. So she would eliminate Mike. As although Mike would be the bigger threat as well, and she would think that Zoe deserves to be in the finale more than Mike. Zoe and Dawn are both in the finale, with most people with basically B supporting Dawn, and they have to fight like Lightning and Cameron. And I do think Zoe would beat Dawn in this season, as I think she'd be stronger. However, you could write it in a way to where Dawn wins and Zoe trips on a rock. That's the alternate ending. So this is the elimination order for Revenge of the Island, and now we go on to All Stars.